Well, what do you think about the statement, everybody wants to be happy? Do we agree with that? Disagree with that? I think everybody agrees with that. I agree with that because I want to be happy, and I think everybody I know does. The problem with that may be, what does that mean? I'm not looking for you to shout out answers, but what does that mean to be happy? As I was thinking about it this week, I thought, in some ways, it's kind of like trying to define the word love, isn't it? Everybody knows what it is, but it's really hard to put into words what it means to be happy. And part of that is probably because happiness to one person isn't the same as it would be to somebody else, at least not in the way that we might look at it or view it. So I did what I do every week. I got onto the internet and I went to dictionary.com. Anybody ever use that? Some of us. That's my go-to dictionary anymore, or thesaurus if I'm looking for a big word. But dictionary.com gave a definition of happy, and I don't know if it's helpful or not. They defined happiness as being pleased. Being pleased. Or the feeling, showing, or causing pleasure or satisfaction. Being pleased. Showing satisfaction or causing pleasure for someone else. And again, I thought, if you ask people, if I was to ask you this morning, share with me what pleases you. If there were 12 people I asked, probably I would have 12 completely different answers. Because we tend to look at some of those things differently. So then I had some fun, and I went on to Google, and I put in, what do I need to do to be happy? Wow! That's a dangerous search topic, I'm sure. I found some really good stuff, and I found some not so good stuff. But WebMD had an article that was entitled, 7 Ways to be Happy. And I suppose that it wasn't a bad article. I could probably put a Bible verse to every one of these and preach on each one of them. I thought they were overall good. WebMD said this, if you want to be happy, don't worry. Choose happiness. Now, I agree with that, but I also agree that it may be easier said than done. They also said, cultivate gratitude. If you want to be happy, be gracious. Show gratitude. Number 3, foster forgiveness. Now, there's a challenge one. I was talking with someone earlier this week that was talking about somebody in their life in the past and some of the bitter, horrible things that they've done and the struggle that they had to forgive them. And I thought, as long as we hang on to bitterness, happiness can elude us. And so that's certainly important. Number 4, counteract negative thoughts and feelings with more positive things. That's pretty good. And then it said, remember, money cannot buy happiness. I thought, okay, that's a good lesson. Foster friendship. Have friends. And foster being friendly with others. And I thought, that's a pretty good thing. And then the last one that they named was engage in meaningful activities. Engage in meaningful activities. And so I thought, well, that was a pretty good article. It wasn't biblically based, but I think that we could probably find a precedent in Scripture for every one of those. So then I went to the next article. And the next article was, here's the title of it. 10 ways to trick yourself into being happy. And I thought, okay, so happiness then is deceiving myself. I thought, that's ridiculous. If we have to trick ourselves into being happy, are we really happy? Or are we just deceived? And so then I got to thinking about, in the article, I'm not going to share all the things the article said, but then I got thinking about, okay, how do we deceive ourselves into being happy? How do we deceive ourselves? How do we sometimes trick ourselves into being happy? And I came up in my own mind with a list of things. And I hope that you'll agree with these. Sometimes people think that happiness is just based on luck. Just based on luck. Happiness is the result of circumstances that we have no control over. And if my circumstances would just change, then I could be happy. Don't raise your hand. Anybody ever thought that? You don't have to raise your hand. I think we all have at times. If I could just have this change, I could really be happy in my life. When we say that, we're saying happiness is based on luck. Something outside of my control allowing me to be happy. Obviously, another one has to do with money. And I thought, the whole lottery system in our country is built on the statement, $1 in a dream. What does that say? If you just get lucky and have enough money, all your problems will be gone and you'll be happy. I think the exact opposite of that is true in many cases. But that's one way that people deceive themselves into understanding what happiness is. Things. How often do people look at things that they want and think, if only? I read a number of years ago that, Sunday afternoon, a lot of people get the Sunday paper and they pull out the ads and they read through it, right? And they think, oh, if only I could have that. If I could only get this. And we look at that and we dream about those things as if they will really make us happy. Another thing is relationships. How many people have said or have we heard say, if only the right person would come into my life. Usually they're talking husband or wife. If only the right person comes into my life, if I could only have the right relationship, then I could be happy. And the only reason I'm not happy now is because I have the wrong relationship. I've heard that over and over and over again. Another one is health. Those struggling with health issues always think, if I could only be healthy, I could be happy. Again, as if something outside of our control chooses whether we are happy or not happy. And I believe that all of those things have to do with deceiving ourselves about what happiness or pleasure or satisfaction really is. Because ultimately, none of those things provide true happiness. Oh, they seem that way for a while. You get into a new relationship with somebody. If you've struggled in an old relationship, all of a sudden you have a feeling of pleasure and happiness. But it soon passes. The same with money or fortune or things. All of them can provide happiness for a time, but it's short-lived. It's not a long-lasting type of satisfaction. Well, I believe in the Scripture, in the Gospels, Jesus talked about happiness as well, in many ways. Jesus had been teaching crowds of people. And in Matthew chapter 4, beginning in verse 23, we kind of get a summary of what had been going on as Jesus was going about teaching. It says, and Jesus went throughout all of Galilee teaching in the synagogues, and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, in healing every disease and every affliction among the people. So his fame spread throughout all of Syria, and they brought him all the sick, those afflicted with various diseases and pains, those that were oppressed by demons, epileptics, paralytics, and he healed them. And great crowds followed him from Galilee, and from Decapolis, and from Jerusalem and Judea, and from beyond the Jordan. So Jesus in Matthew 24 has been traveling about all of those places that we mentioned, and he's been teaching. And as people come to him with diseases, and it lists all of the various diseases, Jesus healed them. It was an amazing thing. And I'm sure that many of them felt, now that they had been healed, that their life would be different. That they would know a pleasure or a happiness that they had never known before. And there's no question that they would have for a short time. But now in Matthew 5, Jesus, looking at the crowds that had been following, looking at those that had been listening to him, looking at those that he had healed, he went up into the mountain. And as he went up into the mountain, as he often did, I'm sure that he sat down, and you can almost picture his disciples sitting around him. They're all sitting around him, and he's going to take this opportunity to teach them something. And in the next 12 verses or so, he says 8 times, blessed are. Blessed are. And he's explaining to them where God's blessing truly comes from. Well, before we dive into the word, or to the things that Jesus listed there, what does the word blessed mean? What does it mean? At its root, the word blessed means great, or to have great things. If you go into the Old Testament, the word blessed means that on several occasions. In Genesis chapter 1, it says about Adam and Eve, God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. What does blessed mean then? Well, blessed means that they're going to have kids. They're going to be fruitful and they're going to be multiplying and they're going to fill the earth. God is going to bless them with that. It also means that they're going to have dominion. They are blessed with dominion over the animals and the other things that are on the earth. In Deuteronomy chapter 28, he said, blessed shall the fruit of your womb, or blessed shall be the fruit of your womb, and the fruit of the ground, and the fruit of your cattle, the increase of your herds, and the young of your flock. In Deuteronomy 28, God is telling the people of Israel as they go into the land, if you're obedient to me, I will bless you. And the blessing is, your cattle will be great, your families will be big. That was God's blessing. As we get into the New Testament, however, the idea of being blessed, the meaning of it changes. And in the New Testament, the word blessed, by one commentator, is defined as a symbol of happiness identified by a character that is pure. A symbol of happiness characterized by a character that is pure, a character that is right with God. In Revelation chapter 14, this sounds like a strange verse, especially in light of how blessed was used in the Old Testament. In Revelation 14, he says, and I heard the voice from heaven saying, write this, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Well, that certainly doesn't mean the same thing it meant in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, it meant God would give them great families and great cattle and great blessings. But now he said, blessed are those who die in the Lord. So that can't mean the same thing. It's got to mean something different. And what he's talking about here is the blessing that comes from being in the Lord. The blessing that comes from having a character that is right and pure before the eyes of God. It's in that context of the word blessed that Jesus speaks in Matthew chapter 5. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus is describing here what it means to be blessed by God. He's talking about a spiritual blessing that comes from knowing that our life is right with God. And knowing that our life is right with God is something that money cannot buy and circumstances cannot take away. He's talking about something much deeper than just happiness in our lives. He's talking about contentment and satisfaction in knowing that our life is right with God. Now, many of the commentaries that I read over the last couple of weeks simply defined blessed as happiness. And I don't totally disagree with that. I don't totally disagree with that. But the trouble I have with simply using the word happiness here is what does that normally imply in our lives? If they're happy, everything must be wonderful, right? If you're happy, everything's got to be great in your life. And I don't think here that Jesus is simply talking about external happiness and laughter and those type of things in our lives. I believe Jesus here is talking about something much deeper than that. I believe he's talking about an inner sense of satisfaction. Knowing that we are absolutely right with God and nothing else matters. I believe that Jesus is talking about that deep sense of satisfaction. I know that I am right with God. I know that God is pleased in my life. And that's the most important thing I can strive for. And again, that's something that money can't buy. And it's something that our circumstances, when we truly know that, our circumstances cannot change. Now, what I want to look at is a few of these things that Jesus explains causes blessing in our lives. And I dare say they're the exact opposite of how the world looks at these things. They are the exact opposite of what most people would think. Number one, blessed are those who are poor in spirit. Poor in spirit. What does he mean by poor in spirit? Poor in spirit has the idea of living in dependence on God. Living in dependence on God. As opposed to living independently of God. As if I have no need of God. A person who is poor in spirit gets out of bed in the morning and recognizes, in order to get through this day, I need God's help. Whether I go to work, whether I stay home, whether I go out into the community, whether I go to school, no matter what I do today, I am absolutely 100% dependent on God. That's what he means, I believe, when he talks about being poor in spirit. Living knowing that we need God in our lives. Here's a number of sentences that I'm going to read that explain what I mean. Those who feel capable of being good parents will fail to experience the power of God in their parenting. Those that say, you know what, I know how to parent my kids, I'm a good parent, are never going to experience God's power in their parenting because they're relying on themselves. Those who feel capable of being a good husband or a good wife will never experience the power of God in their marriage. Because they're saying by their attitude, I don't need God. At the same time, the husband or the wife that says, you know what? I struggle to be the spouse that I need to be. I need God's help. Is going to see God working in their marriage in ways that they can't even imagine. Because they recognize their dependence on God. Those who feel capable of ministering as they feel led to minister will never experience the power of God in their ministry. When I am serving God, whether it be preaching or teaching or working in Awana or counseling or any of those other things, if I believe that I am capable of doing that on my own, I will never experience God's power in doing those things, ever. He says, blessed are those who are poor in spirit. Blessed are those who recognize they need God in their lives. Those who feel capable of pursuing their career choice in life will never experience the power of God in their career. They will not experience the power of God because they're saying, I don't need God. Those who feel capable of being good students, preparing for life, will never experience the power of God in their learning because they're saying, I don't need God. I don't need God. Those that are poor in spirit recognize that they are not capable in and of themselves. And because they recognize that, they will rely wholly on God to work and will experience the power of God that many others will never see. Because they recognize they need God. I was thinking about that a little bit more, and I thought, when we feel self-sufficient, what does that lead to? What does that lead to? Oftentimes, we think it leads to happiness. We think it leads to satisfaction. I don't need anybody. I can do it on my own. What does it lead to? It leads to at least three things. Number one, it leads to pride. Look what I've done. Look what I've accomplished. How many times have we heard people bragging about, look what I've accomplished. Look at what I've done. As if they didn't need anyone else. It leads to pride. It also leads to becoming self-centered. If I don't need anybody else, who's it all about? It's all about me. It's all about me. It also leads to being ungrateful. Because if I do it all myself, then what am I entitled to? I'm entitled to everything. I deserve it. I did it. I worked hard for it. I accomplished it. And yet when we're poor in spirit, it leads to the opposite of those things. It leads to humility. It leads to humility. I'm humble because without God's help, I couldn't have done anything. I would have failed if God had not been involved. It leads to the opposite of being self-centered. Because at that point, it's not about me. It's about God. It's about what God did. It also leads to me being grateful. If I am poor in spirit, I am grateful. Because everything that I have been given, every way that I have benefited, every way that I have gotten ahead was a blessing of God in my life. It came about by the power of God. And I become grateful because I reflect continually on how God has worked and what God has done in my life. Jesus begins the Beatitudes by saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. They will see and know the power and the working of God in their lives. And then he moves to the next one. And this almost sounds completely backwards. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who mourn. Now, it almost seems backwards to have blessing or happiness and mourning in the same sentence. Because when we think of happiness, mourning would not be part of what we thought. It wouldn't be part of our definition. And so what does he mean here when he says, "Blessed are those who mourn"? Now, you may have a difference of opinion on this than I do, because mine changed in the last couple of weeks. For years, when I read that passage, I always interpreted it to mean, blessed are those who mourn sin. And those that mourn sin and therefore put sin out of their lives. Now, I do believe that's important. But I believe here now, I understand this in a little different context. I think he's saying something else. And I thought, the things that Jesus is talking about here are characteristics that we would be able to look at Jesus' life and see. For example, was Jesus poor in spirit? Absolutely he was. He was continually relying on who? The Father. And he continually pointed back to the Father and prayed for the strength of the Father to do what he sent him to do. Well, if we apply that to blessed are those that mourn, we see an example of Jesus mourning with other people. If you are, I'm sure you're familiar with John chapter 11 with Lazarus. And you remember Lazarus was sick and dying, and Mary and Martha sent for Jesus. And Jesus waited several days and then went to where Lazarus was. And how long had he been dead when he got there? 4 days. And Jesus went down to the grave with Mary and Martha and the others. What did he do with them? He wept. Why did Jesus weep? I mean, he was about to raise Lazarus out of the grave. Why did he weep? Because those around him were weeping. And Jesus had a relationship with those that were around him. And it was demonstrated by his mourning with them. And I believe the idea of mourning implies at least a deep connection with other people. And Jesus had the type of connection that if you wept, he wept. If you rejoiced, he rejoiced. And I believe here in some way that this weeping implies a relationship with other people. And I believe that one of the ways that we find true blessing in our lives is by connecting, more than superficially, connecting with those that are around us. Having a deep relationship with those around us, that we can mourn with those that mourn, that we can weep with those that weep, we can rejoice with those that rejoice. And Jesus had that type of connection. How many times many times was Jesus walking down the street and there were people that were sitting along the street that were suffering? Blindness, lameness, demon possession, whatever else. And how many times did Jesus, because he had a personal connection with people in need, how many times did Jesus stop? And what did the disciples say almost every time? Come on, we got to get going. We don't have time for this. We don't have time to stop to those blind guys along the road. We got important things to do. And what did Jesus do? No, wait a minute. I got time for those people. They're hurting. There was a connection there. And I thought, how many times are we told in our lives today, if you really want to be happy, spend more time thinking about yourself? How many times have we heard that? I've heard that over and over and over. Now, I don't think we can completely ignore ourselves. I mean, if we completely ignore ourselves, well, we're not going to be able to be an encouragement to anybody. But I also think that we need to many times put other people ahead of ourselves, which is what he talks about next. Jesus had a relationship that went beyond the surface with other people. And I believe that we need to do the same thing today if we're going to know the blessing of God in our lives. He goes on in his next statement in verse 5, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." And meekness goes right along with what we just said. There isn't a lot of differences. Meekness means putting ourselves second and other people first. And again, the idea is one of humility. Best example I can think of was Jesus in, I believe it was the upper room with his disciples. And you remember what they did. They all went in and sat down and they started to look around at each other. And what did they think? I ain't washing his feet. No. You ever see Don's feet? I ain't touching those things. Sorry, Don. Don's the furthest one away from me, so he can't reach me. I ain't washing Don's feet. And I can pick on Don because he's looking at me like, "You think I'm touching your feet?" I ain't doing none of that. And Jesus and his disciples are all looking at, or not Jesus, the disciples are all looking at each other, and that's what they're thinking. They ain't washing Peter's feet. What are you, crazy? Matthew's feet? I ain't touching those. No way. And what does Jesus do? Without saying a word. He gets up from the table where he's sitting, puts a towel around his waist, and he squats down, I don't know who's, Peter's feet, and he begins to wash them. And what do they say? "You're not washing my feet." And Jesus said, if I am your Lord, and I'm going to ad lib here, if I'm your Lord, you need to be washing my feet. But I'm down washing yours. Why? Because you're more important than I am. And I thought, that's the attitude of meekness. That's the idea of being meek. And I thought, if we want to know God's blessing in our lives, we need to be careful and make sure that we stop looking down our noses at people around us and be willing to put them ahead of ourselves. Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those that are meek." And then he says, and this will be the last one, lest you think I'm only halfway through it, it's noon. The last one he says, the last one we're going to look at today, he said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied." Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Jesus said here, blessing comes from craving fellowship with God, from seeking after God's righteousness. Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 11 says, God has put eternity in our hearts. There's a couple of ways of looking at that. But one of the ways of looking at that verse is that God created in us a God-sized hole that only God can fill. And that hole, that emptiness is only filled in our lives when we seek God. And we seek God's righteousness. And we seek that relationship with God. Now, many people today try to fill that hole with other things that they think is going to take care of that hole and give them satisfaction. And that can be, relationships, money, things, all of the things that we mentioned earlier. And yet, all of those things that we might fill that hole in our lives with leave us empty and wanting something else. And Jesus is saying here, blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. Blessed are those that crave and seek after knowing God in their lives. As I said, there's several more, and we'll pick it up next week and look at the rest of those. But I think, as we end this morning, I want to say this, and you've heard me say this often. There's an important thing that I want you to take away from the message this morning. And certainly all of those Beatitudes are important. But here is my fear after preaching a message like this. My fear is, and this will sound backwards if you haven't heard me say this before, my fear is that everybody will leave saying, you know what, I'm going to be committed to putting other people first. And I'm going to really try hard to do that this week. And I'm going to really try hard to seek after being righteous this week. And I'm going to try really hard to depend on God this week. I think that's a mistake. I don't think Jesus is preaching these things so that we go out and try harder to do that. I believe that these things in some way are a barometer of where we are in our relationship with God. Because ultimately, I can go out and make myself try to love other people this week. But what am I doing? Doing it in my own power. Doing it in my own strength. And from my own experience, I can tell you this. When my relationship with God is what it should be, I struggle very little with all of these things. When my relationship with God is not what it should be, I struggle with every one of those things. And so as you think through those Beatitudes this morning, if you can look at your life and say, I'm really struggling in all of those areas, commit to something other than doing them this week. Commit to renewing your relationship with God. And as your relationship with God begins to change and become more intimate, you won't have any trouble loving other people. You won't have any trouble depending on God. Those all come out of our relationship with God. And so use these things as a barometer to honestly say, where is my relationship with God this week? And maybe I need to work on my relationship with God. Maybe I need to begin a relationship with God. Maybe I need to spend more time in prayer. Maybe I need to spend more time in the Word of God. Maybe I just need to lean on God more and trust God more. Work on your relationship with God. And you'll begin to see God work out these Beatitudes in your heart and life. Let's take a moment and bow for prayer. Our Heavenly Father, I thank you this morning for your Word. I thank you for the blessings that Jesus promised here upon those that were poor in spirit, those that mourned, those that were meek, those that sought after righteousness. And Lord, we know from other places in your Word that all of these come out of our relationship with you. They're not things we can make ourselves do and you'll be pleased with because we're working hard at it. They're things that you produce through your Spirit in our heart and lives. And Lord, I pray that this week that we would have a deeper walk, a deeper relationship with you. And that out of that relationship, we would begin to see these characteristics or these traits become a regular part of our lives. Lord, again, we thank you for what you will accomplish. In Christ's name.